Welcome to FA Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Glenn Call, retired CIA officer, who is now senior partner at FOI. As usual, we look at the three most important issues of the month. The top issues for October 2024 are: the Israel-Iran conflict is getting more dangerous. It's number one. Number two, make sense of BRICS summit in Russia. Number three, Rachel Reeves delivers important post-Brexit budget. So let's get cracking with Israel-Iran conflict is getting more dangerous. In the early hours of Saturday, 26 October, Israel officially attacked Iran for the first time. Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, were responding to Iran's missile attacks on Israel on Tuesday, 1st October. On that day, Iran had launched 181 ballistic missiles. The proxy war between these two countries is clearly over. For the first time in history, Israel and Iran are in open conflict, if not full-scale war. So before we dive deeper into this issue, let's get through the chronology of the Israel-Iran conflict.
Don't go back too far, because there are probably 3,000 years to cover there.
Yes, we won't go back 3,000 years. We'll go back a few weeks. Israel bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, the capital of Syria, killing many senior officials on Monday, 1st of April. Iran responded by mobilizing its allies in the axis of resistance to seize Israeli-linked ship MSC Ares and launch strikes on Israeli territory on Saturday, 13 April. Now, before we carry on, the axis of resistance includes Shia groups such as Islamic Resistance in Iraq, Popular Mobilization Forces, the Syrian government, Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Yemeni Houthi movement. Sometimes,
excuse me, Atul, if I can just jump in for a moment.
Yeah.
For years and years, they've been at each other's throats through proxies and intelligence, ostensibly covert intelligence operations. But that was the first direct military action taken by one against the other. Thus, Israel's response.
So it's a new chapter. It's a completely new chapter in the region and in the world. So sometimes this axis is said to include Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups. Now, once this happened, Israel retaliated with limited strikes on targets in Syria and Iran on Friday, 19 April. Everyone's honor was temporarily satisfied after the strike. Israel claimed victory. Iran declared Israeli attacks to be mere piffle. Tensions abated. Things went back to proxy conflict between the two countries. On Wednesday, 31 July, Israelis spectacularly assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the chairman of the Hamas political bureau. If they had done this in, say, Qatar, which is where he was normally resident, wouldn't have been a problem. But they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the capital of Iran, in a VIP guest house. And this followed the killing of Hezbollah's senior military commander, Fuad Shukr, a few hours earlier. In this 26 October attack, dozens of Israeli warplanes flew at least 1,300 kilometers from their bases to launch missiles against Iranian air defense facilities. These were mainly, from what we read, S-300 radars and missile launchers, and missile factories in 3 Iranian provinces, including near Tehran. Our intelligence sources tell us that Israeli leaders are considering strikes on Iranian oil terminals, missile sites, and nuclear facilities. One ex-MI6 source is convinced that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might strike Targ Island, Iran's oil terminal in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, the idea of special forces might carry out targeted killings, especially of key IRGC personnel. Now, IRGC is Praetorian Guard. It is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, very powerful. They run an economy within an economy. They are the true believers in the system, and they have the capability to inflict a lot of violence, and weakening them is a key Israeli strategic goal. Now,
And the
Israel's
IRGC it has morphed into. Originally, it was not the. It was set up as a rival, you could even say, to the army itself. But over the 40 plus years of the Iranian regime, it has become really the central power, the guiding power, the ruling entity of Iran. It serves the mullahs, and the mullahs depend on the IRGC.
So it's important to remember, and this is where we get to the meat of the matter, not the what, but why. Why are both countries behaving this way? Now, um, Iran's mullahs have sought legitimacy from their public by standing up to the US, the great Satan, and the Zionist client, the Crusader state Israel. And they have failed to deliver on many things. They failed to deliver on economic growth. They failed to deliver on jobs. Now, part of it is because of Western sanctions, but part of it is also because the regime has not followed the most sensible economic policies, and the regime has also become corrupt. It stands on civil liberties, particularly forcing women to wear hijab, and cracking down on them has not proved popular. We saw some months ago, we saw lots of protests on Iran's streets, on Tehran's streets, and indeed other cities. And so this is one issue that does mobilize much of the population behind the regime. The Iranian regime, the mullahs, have to stand up to Israel for their own popular legitimacy and also for their wider appeal, not just in the Shiite world, but also in the Muslim world. So, in a way, they may not want war, but they cannot be seen to be weak, particularly now that Israel has decimated the top rung of the Hezbollah leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah, including all the elite Radwan force commanders. So, it is important for the Iranian leaders to be seen to act. Now, when we get to Israel, there, Bibi Netanyahu is in a fractious coalition with a far-right bunch of loonies. Some of these want greater Israel. Some of these wonderful gentlemen want to resettle Gaza, have a biblical state, or rather, a state of Israel with the historic biblical borders, whatever they are. God knows that depends on which version of the Bible you're using and which interpretation. Bibi Netanyahu needs to stay in power fundamentally to avoid a massive corruption scandal and a trial. And should he no longer be prime minister, there's a real risk he could be in prison. So for Bibi, it is important to be in power as long as possible. And Bibi has a messianic view that he is indeed the savior of Israel. He is the one strong leader in a weak and fractious country who can stand up to the extremely devious Palestinians. And therefore, he is pursuing a more and more aggressive policy. And in his view, this is a historic opportunity. This offers him a window to hit Iran because he and many other Israelis do think Iran is an existential threat to Israel. Because Iran has constantly argued for the destruction of the Jewish state. So here, whilst both sides have strategic imperatives to act against each other and to weaken each other, There is also an internal political dynamic going on. Over to you, Glenn.
But if anything, I think you soft pedaled your description of the Israeli right's objective, the far right, the religious right in Israel, the parties which make it possible for Netanyahu to stay in power, do seek a greater Israel, which means for the ultras, it would mean the removal of all Palestinians from Gaza, but more proximately and imperatively on the West Bank. The colonization program has gone on since 1967 and has accelerated in the past couple of decades, so that something like 84% of what formerly was the West Bank is now controlled by or settled by Israeli colonizers, settlers. So why is
And
this
by the way, Glenn, just to interject, this is something that many Israeli defense forces, IDF leaders, oppose because it stretches their lines. It makes the military's job more difficult. So this is not something that necessarily all of Israelis want and approve. The
no,
secular
I think a clear
Israelis certainly
majority
don't want it.
oppose. Yeah, I think a clear majority of Israelis oppose the de jure and de facto annexation of the West Bank. Although after the October 7 attack by Hamas into Israel a year ago, the support for more severe measures in the among the Israeli public has increased. But so why is this current series of seemingly tit for tat, schoolyard like exchanges of breastfeeding and attacks more significant than the previous 40 years of that? Well, with the October 7 attack, the visceral and understandable response by a large majority of Israelis has been enough, and Netanyahu hasn't, extremist though one may be able to portray him, with regard to the existential fear that has come to shape much of the Israeli population. He's not too far out of harmony with the general fear and desire for strong action. Every time I have had discussions with Israelis in interviews or one-on-one, and I've said the standard position, really, which I think should be not too controversial, which is that it is not possible to destroy the ideology or theology that motivates and the resentments that motivate the Palestinians, specifically Hamas, by military actions. And if anyone needed a vivid example of that, America's war on terror, trying to kill all the terrorists, should suffice as evidence that that approach cannot work. The response has been vehement that such a view is naive, and of course they're going to eliminate them all. Literally, I don't think that is possible to do. So the ideological belief that the Israelis are usurpers and evil, and Israel must be eliminated and the lands of Palestine restored to the Palestinians. There's sincerity in that, but there's also cynicism, because Iran has sought to project its power, its influence, and by projecting its power to protect itself from the perfidious West, in particular the United States, by having Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthi, so on, as these surrogate groups that it has financed, trained, and supports. However, the past year has shown that Iran's power projection tools are incapable of standing up to Israel, with the exception of through these, they're more than pinpricks, but these terrorist assaults or rocket launches and so on, which can harass, irritate, create problems, instill fear, but not threaten the state. And we have seen now, nor can they protect Iran from Israel if Israel strikes out. Also, Iran, so that it's significant because Iran's military abilities have been shown to be, with respect to Israel at least, the proverbial paper tiger. Their air force cannot strike Israel; it would be destroyed in a conflict. Their missiles are the only means they have to strike, and Israeli and U.S. and Jordanian missile defense systems have largely rendered that tool to defanged it to a large extent.
I
The
mean, Glenn,
regime is
some people differ there. It would be only fair to point out that uh, some of the Israelis themselves say that we do not have very strong anti-ballistic missile defenses, and that's the one area of vulnerability. And they also admit that the Iranians were able to strike more than the Israelis publicly admitted. So the Iranians, yes, they may be a paper tiger in many ways, but they certainly have a few arrows in their quiver.
I think they could, if they used all their missiles or a large percentage of them, harm Israel. But they also realize now, and have always realized, that the Israelis can cause dramatic damage and harm to the regime. As you pointed out, the
Actually,
regime is brittle. When after the
that
first
is the
missile strike,
Israeli calculus. The Israeli
yes,
calculus is that if we strike their oil port and if we strike their nuclear facilities, one will destroy the economy, and B, it'll stop the existential threat we face. And the regime itself will implode given the already restive minorities and young people and women. And in fact, that is why they are acting in more and more an adventurous manner. And it is only US diplomacy that has kept Israeli action curtailed this time around.
certainly it's a fear of the mullahs themselves. There were demonstrations in Iran supporting Israel's action because the regime is so unpopular among most Iranians. Certainly, those born after the revolution is a small percentage, as generally is the case, who remain ardent supporters of the revolution. So Iran has consistently, from October 7 on, clearly indicated that it seeks to avoid a wider war. Actually, and yet they have continued to support the actions of Hezbollah and of Hamas, which are launching rockets into Israel. But a wider war, the regime in Tehran realizes, would gravely endanger its continued existence, even absent any invasion. Israel's not going to invade Iran. That's just not going to happen. So, what, however, is likely to happen from this? Because the fundamental causes, the underlying problems, are not being addressed at all. And they are the Palestinians' plight in Gaza and on the West Bank. Israel can has a short-term security and medium-term should be for a number of years, but without addressing the underlying reason for anger, grievance, and actions by the Palestinians, the fundamental circumstances remain the same. And Israel is sitting on, living a time bomb. As a democracy, there already are in Iran, I think it's 25% of the population is Muslim. And demographically, in
Over
the
20.
coming
I don't think it's 25 yet, but over 20
20,
now. Yeah,
20, in the coming decades,
I'd
that
check.
will continue to increase in percentage, which poses an existential dilemma for Israel if it does not address the underlying grievance of the Palestinian population. The result of this may be medium-term security for Israel, likely that there won't be a wider war, but increasing the likelihood dramatically that at last Iran will actually develop a nuclear weapon, because that is the one vaccine from invasion that has been effective since World War II.
So those of you who have questions, please type them out and we'll take them. There's a broader impact on the global economy coming from an increase in tensions and the risk of all-out war. Simply the oil prices will inevitably go up if Iran and Israel go to war. Iran has vowed to strike Sunni kingdoms, which it sees as allied with Israel, the Gulf kingdoms. And things could get really ugly. And that is why the US is so keen to avoid the escalation of this proxy war into all-out conflict, because once that happens, we've already seen what an oil price rise can do to inflation and therefore interest rates. We will see a knock-on effect on the global economy. Remember, in 1973 and 1979, there were two oil crises. 1973 was when OPEC states said, we'll charge higher for oil. That was also the year of war. If we forget, lest we forget, that was the Yom Kippur War. And then, of course, 1979 is the Iranian Revolution itself. So huge implications. We do have one question. We will take it. The big question is, what can Israel do without a full commitment from the US? And can the US afford to engage? Glenn, over to you.
Well,
this is from Peter Isaacs.
The U.S. policy has been to support Israel's existence and security that way, while trying to convince it to reach a peace agreement which grants a statehood to Palestine somehow. American influence has always been, and certainly is now more than ever, less powerful than just about everyone who hasn't worked in the State Department or the CIA believes. The U.S. Doesn't have as much influence as it is imagined to or once did. Without the American guarantee, I still think that Israel is at this point so strong and stable and able to produce much of its own weaponry that fundamentally its existence would not be threatened, but it would certainly be a grave issue if that were to occur.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.